On that final day in 1975, Frank Johnson was on the last helicopter out. Saigon was burning. People were desperately trying to escape. He was one of the last American soldiers. 50 years later, that same Frank was living under a bridge in Seattle, and nobody knew who he was. Welcome to Vietnam Stories. Before we begin this powerful Vietnam veteran story, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, don't forget to subscribe. Seattle, a cold November morning in 2024. Under the Interstate 5 bridge, between gray concrete pillars, a small tent stood. While the city's noise passed overhead, deep silence reigned below. In this silence lived a 74-year-old man, Frank Johnson. Frank woke up at the same time every morning, exactly a 500. Military discipline still remained in his body 50 years later. He would carefully fold his old sleeping bag, organize his few belongings, and clean his surroundings, as if he were still in a military camp. Nobody knew his name. Social workers called him Bridge Guy. Police officers called him Old Timer. But no one knew that this man had played a role in one of the most important moments in American history 50 years ago. That morning, sitting under the bridge as usual, he heard a helicopter sound in the distance. It was Seattle Police's routine patrol, but for Frank that sound was something else. That sound took him back to 1975, to Saigon, to those final days, to those chaotic hours. April 30th, 1975. Operation Frequent Wind. Saigon was falling and American forces were conducting the final evacuation. Frank Johnson was then 25 years old, a staff sergeant serving in the Army Security Agency. His mission: secure classified documents and ensure the evacuation of the last American personnel. That day, chaos reigned in Saigon's streets. South Vietnamese forces had begun to collapse, and the North Vietnamese army was entering the city. Hundreds of people were trying to take refuge in the American embassy, and Frank was on one of the last helicopters. "Johnson, move, move, move!" the commander had shouted. "We're the last bird out." Frank was standing on the embassy roof at that moment. Below, desperate South Vietnamese were trying to get onto the helicopter, but there was no room. Frank had to make a decision at the last moment: his own life or the lives of others. He had jumped from the helicopter and pushed 3 Vietnamese children inside. Then he himself got on at the last second. That helicopter was the last American military flight out of Saigon, and Frank was on it. But that decision had changed the rest of his life, because Frank, in saving those 3 children, couldn't save his own family. His Vietnamese girlfriend Lynn and their little son David had remained in the city. Frank thought he would get them out on the next helicopter, but the next helicopter never came. 50 years later, Frank still carried that guilt. Survivor's guilt. Why had he gotten out while they stayed? This question had been eating at his mind for 50 years. After returning to America, Frank had tried to build a normal life. He got married, found work, started a family, but like most soldiers returning from Vietnam, he wasn't welcomed by society. There were those who shouted, "Baby killer." Anti-war protesters blamed them. Frank began struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, sudden panic attacks. The faces of Lynn and David never left his mind. The breath they took when he left them behind never left his ears. His wife left him, saying she couldn't take it anymore. As his children grew up, they distanced themselves from their father. Frank became even more isolated. He drifted from job to job. He started drinking, and slowly everything fell apart. In 1995, 20 years later, Frank became completely homeless. He lived in different cities, in different shelters, but he couldn't find peace anywhere until he came to Seattle. In 2010, he found that spot under the bridge, and there he began living quietly. For 14 years, he had been living in the same place, not talking to anyone, not making eye contact with anyone, just existing. He refused assistance from Veterans Affairs. "I don't deserve help," he would say. "I left them behind." That November morning, when the helicopter sound stopped, Frank took a deep breath. He applied therapy techniques. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, trauma management. But some days it wasn't enough. Around 9 a.m., an unusual visitor came. A young woman in her 30s wearing professional clothes, carrying a file. She looked like a social worker but was different. "Excuse me, sir," the woman said respectfully. "I'm Sarah Chen, Veteran Outreach Coordinator. May I speak with you?" Frank shook his head. "I'm not interested in services." "I'm not here for services. I'm here for research." Frank became curious. "What kind of research?" "Vietnam War final evacuation, specifically Operation Frequent Wind. I'm documenting the stories of the last soldiers who left Saigon." Frank's heart rate increased. "I don't know anything about that." Sarah approached carefully. "Sir, I was looking for survivors of the last helicopter missions. There were only a few dozen American soldiers on the final flights. Most are documented, but there are a few missing records." She pulled out a tablet with old photographs on it. Black and white images of helicopters, soldiers, chaos. "This photograph," Sarah said, showing the tablet, "was taken on April 30th, 1975. The last helicopter leaving the embassy roof. We know most of the people in this photo, but there's one soldier we can't identify." Frank looked at the photo and froze. There he was, 25 years old, scared but determined. The soldier in that last helicopter was himself. "Do you recognize anyone in this photo?" Sarah asked. Frank remained silent for a long time. For 50 years, he had been waiting for this moment. Finally, someone was asking. Finally, someone cared. "That's me," he said quietly. Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "The soldier on the left. That's me. Staff Sergeant Frank Johnson, Army Security Agency." Sarah could hardly believe it. You were on the last helicopter out of Saigon?" Frank nodded. Then, for the first time in 50 years, he began telling his story. "We were supposed to be evacuated earlier," Frank said. "But there were delays. I was part of the team securing classified documents. When the final call came, we had minutes to get to the roof." He stopped, remembered. There were hundreds of people trying to get on those helicopters. South Vietnamese who had worked with us, their families, children. We couldn't take everyone. Sarah was taking careful notes. "What happened on that last flight?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. "There were 3 Vietnamese children, maybe 8, 10, 12 years old. They were trying to reach the helicopter but couldn't make it. I jumped out and helped them get on." "Did you give up your seat?" "Not exactly. I got back on, but I had to leave others behind, including—" He stopped. "Including who?" "My girlfriend, Lynn, and our son David. They were supposed to come on the next helicopter, but there was no next helicopter." Sarah pulled out a tissue. "I'm so sorry. I saved 3 children I didn't know, but I couldn't save my own family." Frank's voice broke. "For 50 years I've been asking myself, why them and not Lynn and David?" That day, Sarah talked with Frank for 3 hours. She was a Vietnam War historian and had been researching Operation Frequent Wind for years. Frank's story was one of the missing pieces. "Frank," Sarah finally said, "do you realize what you did? You were part of the most significant evacuation in American military history, and you saved 3 children. I failed my family. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. That's not failure, that's heroism." Frank, for the first time in 50 years, was hearing a different perspective. "What happened to the children you saved?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. I never found out." Sarah opened her tablet. "Frank, I might be able to help with that. I have connections with Vietnamese American communities. If those children survived and came to America, we might be able to find them." Frank's heart began racing. After 50 years, could he learn what happened to those children? The following week, Sarah returned with unexpected news. "Frank, I found them." Frank could hardly believe it. "All 3? "Yes, they're alive. They're in America, and they've built families. And Frank, they remember you." Sarah opened her laptop. On the screen were 3 middle-aged Vietnamese Americans. They were on a video call. "Frank," Sarah said, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Min Nguyen, Professor Lisa Tran, and Engineer Tony Pham, the 3 children you saved in 1975. Frank looked at the screen and felt overwhelming emotion. Those children were now successful adults. Dr. Min spoke first. "Mr. Frank, I've been looking for you for 30 years. You saved my life, Professor Lisa, through tears. I became a teacher because I wanted to help children, just like you helped us, Engineer Tony. I named my son after you, Frank. He's now 25 years old. Frank, for the first time in 50 years, felt the heavy weight lifting from his chest. Those children hadn't just survived, they had thrived, and they all remembered him. I thought I had failed, Frank said. You didn't fail, said Dr. Min. You gave us life. You gave us America. You gave us a future. That conversation completely changed Frank's life. For the first time in 50 years, he made peace with his past. He understood that his decision hadn't been wrong. He had made the best choice in an impossible situation. Sarah offered Frank more help. Frank, there are veteran services available. Housing assistance, trauma treatment, health care. I don't deserve it, he said. Yes, you do. You served your country with honor. You saved lives. You deserve support, she said. Slowly, Frank began accepting help. First, therapy. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma specialist, began weekly sessions with him. Frank, Dr. Martinez said in the first session, survivor's guilt is common among Vietnam veterans. You're not alone in this, but I left people behind. You also saved people. Both can be true. Trauma comes from thinking you had control over an uncontrollable situation. Therapy was a slow process. 50 years of guilt doesn't disappear overnight. But gradually, Frank began to understand. He was a victim of circumstances, neither hero nor villain. 6 months later, Frank left from under the bridge. Veterans Affairs provided him with a small apartment. For the first time in 14 years, he slept in a real bed. But the biggest change was emotional. He established regular contact with Dr. Min, Professor Lisa, and Engineer Tony. They became his extended family. Video calls, letters, even visits. Tony's son Frank, his namesake, was in college and writing his thesis on the Vietnam War. He interviewed old Frank. Mr. Johnson, young Frank said, my dad says you're a hero, but you don't think so. Why? Old Frank thought carefully. Because heroes don't leave people behind, but heroes save people. And you saved my dad and his friends. Doesn't that count? That question gave old Frank a new perspective. Maybe heroism wasn't about saving everyone. Maybe it was about saving who you could. On Veterans Day 2024, an unexpected invitation came. Seattle Veterans Affairs wanted to honor Frank for his role in Operation Frequent Wind. He initially wanted to refuse. I don't deserve recognition. But Dr. Martinez convinced him. Frank, recognition isn't just for you. It's for all Vietnam veterans who never got the proper welcome home. On ceremony day, Frank was nervous. He wore a suit, clean-shaven but still uncomfortable in the spotlight. There were hundreds of veterans in the convention center. Families, active-duty military, community members. When Frank took the stage, he received a standing ovation. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ceremony host, Staff Sergeant Frank Johnson, one of the last American soldiers to leave Saigon, April 30th, 1975. Frank approached the microphone. For 50 years, he hadn't wanted to tell this story, but now the time had come. I'm not here as a hero, he began. I'm here as a survivor, and I want to talk about the cost of surviving. The audience was completely silent. 50 years ago, I was on the last helicopter out of Saigon. I made decisions that haunted me for decades. I saved some people, I left others behind. For 50 years, I focused on who I couldn't save. Today, I want to focus on who I did save. Photos of Dr. Min, Professor Lisa, and Tony appeared on the screen. These 3 children grew up to become a doctor, a professor, and an engineer. They have families, children, grandchildren. Because of one moment, one decision, dozens of lives exist today. He stopped, composed himself. I spent 50 years thinking I had failed. I was homeless, broken, guilty, but I learned something recently. Survival isn't failure. Making impossible choices isn't failure. The failure is in not accepting help, not accepting forgiveness, not accepting that we did our best in impossible circumstances. Applause came from the crowd. To my fellow Vietnam veterans, we came home to a country that didn't welcome us. We carried guilt, trauma, pain, but we survived. And our survival matters. Our stories matter. Our service matters. Standing ovation again. I spent 14 years under a bridge because I thought I didn't deserve better. But I learned that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting. Accepting what happened, accepting help, accepting that we deserve to live, not just survive. After the ceremony, Frank was surrounded by the crowd. Vietnam veterans shared their stories with him. Families thanked him. Young people asked questions. The most meaningful encounter was with an elderly Vietnamese American man. "Sir," the man said, "I was one of the boat people. I escaped Vietnam in 1978. I know the sacrifice you made for people like us." Frank embraced that man with tears. After that night, Frank's life was completely transformed. He became an advocate for homeless veterans. He regularly spoke at veteran events. He shared his story in schools, educating young people about the Vietnam War. But the most important change was personal. Dr. Min, Professor Lisa, and Tony became his real family. They organized regular visits. Frank became an honorary grandfather to their children. Tony's son Frank graduated from college and joined the military. "I want to serve like you did," he told old Frank. "Then serve with honor," Frank said. "And remember, sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting. Sometimes it's accepting help." At Christmas 2024, Frank celebrated a real family Christmas for the first time in 50 years. At Dr. Min's house, all three families gathered. Frank sat at the head of the table, surrounded by people whose lives he had saved. "Thank you, Frank," said Dr. Min, raising his glass, "for giving us this moment, this family, this life." Frank raised his glass. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep living." That night, Frank sat in his Seattle apartment looking at old photographs. Vietnam photos, Saigon evacuation, helicopter images. But now these photos brought pride, not pain. He finally understood. Heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about making tough choices and living with consequences. And sometimes living with consequences is the hardest part of heroism. Frank Johnson was no longer bridge guy. He was a survivor, a veteran, an honorary grandfather, and most importantly, he was finally home. 50 years after leaving Saigon, Frank had found his way home. Not to a place, but to peace. This story shows us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on battlefields, but in our own minds. And sometimes coming home isn't about geography. It's about accepting that you deserve to be home. Have you ever encountered someone like this? Someone carrying the weight of the past, but whom no one noticed? What can we do for veterans or trauma survivors? Share in the comments, because every survivor's story is valuable and needs support. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. At Vietnam Stories, we discover the stories of unsung heroes and healing journeys, because everyone deserves to come home, both physically and emotionally.